They said it was impossible, a weapon you could swim with, attach by hand, and vanish before it exploded. But one man built it anyway. Using magnets, scrap metal, and a school pool, he created the first limpet mine, the silent killer of the seas. His name wasn't on any medals, but his inventions changed the course of covert warfare. This is how Cecil Vandepeer Clarke rewrote the rules of sabotage. Before anyone had heard of the Special Operations Executive or the so-called Churchill's Toyshop, Clarke was already experimenting with ways to make destruction smaller, smarter, and more precise. He wasn't a general or a scientist funded by government contracts. He was an engineer from Bedford who spent the interwar years designing caravans and mechanical systems. What made him different was his obsession with function over form, machines that worked simply, quietly, and reliably. When Britain entered World War II, the country faced a critical gap in unconventional weapons. The army had plenty of explosives, but no practical way to deliver them covertly. Sabotage required creativity, not size. That's when Clarke's mechanical instincts found their purpose. His background in civilian engineering, building low-loading trailers and experimenting with suspension systems, had taught him how to distribute weight efficiently and make heavy loads portable. Those same ideas would soon be applied to explosives that needed to be carried, planted and left behind by agents working alone. Clarke began collaborating with another engineer, Stuart McCrae, in a small workshop under the Ministry of Supply's Experimental Division. The problem they faced was clear. Allied divers needed a mine light enough to carry underwater yet strong enough to sink a ship. Traditional naval mines were too bulky. Clarke believed magnets were the answer. If a charge could cling to a steel hull without external mounting, a single swimmer could place it silently. The first prototypes looked nothing like military equipment. Clarke used tin bowls from a department store, sealed the edges with rubber, and fixed magnets scavenged from scrap equipment. Tests began in the most unlikely of places, a school swimming pool in Bedford. Clarke and his small team would submerge the device, check its buoyancy, and test how securely it attached to submerged metal plates. The trials were risky, but revealed a concept that worked, a compact explosive that could attach magnetically and be triggered by a timer fuse. Word spread quietly through the ministry. While conventional designers were occupied with tanks and aircraft, Clarke's limpet mine offered something entirely new, a weapon for individuals, not armies. When he demonstrated the mine's potential, attaching one to a test vessel and successfully detonating it underwater, the Admiralty realized its value. It could cripple ships in port, destroy bridges, or sabotage rail lines without open combat. Still, Clarke's ideas faced skepticism. Military officials were wary of civilian inventors and unconventional methods, yet a few senior officers recognized the need for tools that matched the growing demands of covert warfare. The newly formed Special Operations Executive, the SOE, needed devices like Clarke's mine to train saboteurs across occupied Europe. The small mine was soon standardized, mass-produced, and issued to commandos and resistance units. It became one of the most effective tools for underwater demolition during the war. Clarke's success with the limpet mine didn't stop his experimentation. Once the concept of small portable explosives proved viable, he began developing launch systems and anti-vehicle devices based on the same principle of simplicity. Among his lesser-known projects was the spigot gun, a type of launcher that used a heavy steel rod to project an explosive charge. Unlike traditional artillery, it could be mounted on almost any surface, even trees, allowing small teams to ambush enemy vehicles without detection. The weapon's compact design and low recoil made it ideal for irregular forces and partisans. By this stage, Clarke's workshop had become a nucleus for experimental sabotage equipment. The environment encouraged improvisation. If a concept worked, it was adopted. If not, it was modified immediately. He documented every design meticulously, noting what could be assembled from standard parts. In a war driven by industry, his focus remained on what individuals could carry and use. His inventions soon reached the field. Resistance groups in France, Norway, and the Balkans were trained to use the devices he helped design. The limpet mine alone sank or disabled dozens of Axis vessels, while the spigot launcher proved useful against light armor. Clarke's philosophy was reflected in every project: reliability first, complexity last. He once remarked to a colleague that a weapon was only as effective as its operator's confidence in it. Despite his impact, Clarke remained largely unknown to the public. Much of his work fell under the secrecy of wartime classification. Reports of successful sabotage operations rarely mentioned the technology behind them, let alone its inventor. Within military circles, however, his reputation grew. He was invited to collaborate with the elite weapons research group known as MD1, unofficially dubbed Churchill's Toyshop. There he joined a collection of engineers and thinkers tasked with producing unorthodox devices for special missions, from magnetic bombs to booby traps. His contribution wasn't limited to engineering. Clarke also trained agents in the use of his equipment. At SOE training centers, he instructed operatives on underwater demolition, timing mechanisms, and field improvisation. Many of the saboteurs who later carried out missions in occupied Europe were using his designs or had been personally briefed by him. His emphasis was always on simplicity. A soldier under stress needed something that could not fail. The secrecy of this work meant Clarke's name appeared on few official documents. His inventions were labeled under project codes, patents were delayed, and recognition was sparse. Yet within intelligence and engineering circles, he was known as the man who turned ordinary materials into extraordinary tools. The combination of mechanical creativity and practical testing defined his approach to war. As the conflict escalated, so did the complexity of demands from the field. Clarke began exploring timed fuses, anti-tamper devices, and altitude switches for aircraft sabotage. Each new challenge pushed him further into the realm of experimental warfare, far beyond his pre-war identity as a trailer designer. For someone once considered an outsider to the military establishment, Clarke had quietly become one of its most influential problem solvers. Cecil Vandepeer Clarke's entry into MD1, unofficially known as Churchill's Toyshop, marked the most productive phase of his career. The unit operated from a secluded country house in Buckinghamshire, hidden from conventional command structures and surrounded by secrecy. Its mission was straightforward yet unorthodox: to invent weapons that official departments either dismissed or had no time to develop. For Clarke, it was the perfect environment, a workshop where ingenuity mattered more than hierarchy. Within this isolated think tank, Clarke's practical engineering met the creativity of other specialists. Under the guidance of Major Millis Jeffries, MD1's teams were tasked with producing devices that could give small groups of soldiers or resistance fighters strategic leverage. Unlike the bureaucratic weapons programs that moved slowly through approval chains, MD1 could test, approve, and manufacture within weeks. Clarke thrived in this culture of rapid innovation. One of his earliest projects inside MD1 was refining the limpet mine design for mass production. The initial prototype had proven effective, but field reports exposed weaknesses. Magnets corroded in seawater, timing mechanisms jammed, and detonators were unreliable under pressure. Clarke re-engineered the casing using alloys resistant to saltwater and redesigned the fuse assembly to allow divers to set timers underwater without tools. Each modification made the mine simpler, safer, and deadlier. By the time the SOE standardized it, the limpet mine had become one of the most iconic sabotage weapons of the war. With that success established, Clarke began experimenting with devices that could extend sabotage to new domains, railways, vehicles, and even aircraft. One of his lesser-known developments was an altimeter switch, a mechanism designed to detonate a bomb when an enemy aircraft reached a predetermined altitude. The idea was simple. A saboteur could place an explosive on an enemy bomber before takeoff, and it would detonate only after the plane climbed high enough to ensure destruction. Clarke's team tested multiple pressure-sensitive diaphragms and spring systems until they achieved a design that could be calibrated without electrical power. The device was used selectively by agents operating behind enemy lines, and though details remain classified, post-war reports credited it with several successful operations. Clarke's workshop in MD1 was never static. Tables were cluttered with blueprints, magnets, and improvised detonators. He believed that a good weapon should be easy to build from available materials. This philosophy made his devices ideal for resistance movements across Europe. British intelligence officers could smuggle blueprints rather than finished products, allowing local workshops to produce the weapons themselves. Clarke's designs appeared in Norwegian shipyards, Polish forests, and the French countryside, a proof that innovation could spread even under occupation. Despite his growing list of successes, Clarke remained modest and somewhat eccentric. Colleagues remembered his habit of testing explosives in unlikely places, sometimes using his own car as a mobile lab. Safety officers were less amused, but his results spoke for themselves. The efficiency of his designs reduced training time and increased reliability, both critical for agents operating alone. One of Clarke's boldest concepts emerged from his fascination with portability and surprise: the spigot gun. While Britain was producing massive artillery for open battle, Clarke envisioned a weapon that a single operator could conceal and fire without detection. The system used a simple principle. Instead of firing a shell from a barrel, a heavy steel rod, the spigot, launched the charge from its tip. This eliminated the need for large barrels, reducing weight and cost. Clarke refined the mechanism into a compact anti-tank launcher that could be mounted in trees, trenches, or vehicles. Field tests showed it could penetrate armor at short range, giving guerrilla units a powerful ambush tool. Although the spigot gun never reached the fame of the limpet mine, its design influenced later portable launch systems, including variants used in post-war special forces. Clarke's emphasis on ease of construction meant the weapon could be assembled in field workshops with basic tools, an invaluable feature for resistance movements with limited resources. Outside of the lab, Clarke took a hands-on role in preparing operatives for real missions. At several SOE training sites, he instructed recruits in demolition techniques, mine placement, and timing device calibration. He emphasized understanding the physics behind each mechanism rather than memorizing procedures. His sessions were practical and direct. Build it, arm it, disarm it. Agents left training not only knowing how to use the weapons, but how to adapt them under pressure. Many would later testify that his lessons saved their lives. Clarke's involvement extended to several notable operations, though his name was rarely recorded. Equipment from his workshop was used in missions targeting power plants, supply depots, and shipping lines throughout occupied Europe. In one operation against a transformer station in France, saboteurs used time-delayed charges based on his prototypes to disable critical infrastructure without civilian casualties. Such precision reflected his guiding principle: maximum impact, minimal collateral damage. As MD1 gained prominence, Clarke began collaborating with other British innovators. He exchanged ideas with scientists working on time pencils, booby traps, and magnetic grenades. Together, they created an arsenal of devices that defied conventional classification, weapons designed not for armies, but for individuals. Their collective output gave the Allies a psychological edge, spreading fear among Axis forces who never knew when or how the next attack might come. However, Clarke's independence sometimes brought friction. His disregard for bureaucratic procedure clashed with senior officials accustomed to formal documentation. Reports from the period describe heated discussions over funding and production priorities. Clarke's view was simple. The war demanded results, not paperwork. Churchill himself valued MD1's unorthodox approach and ensured the unit remained under his personal oversight, shielding it from interference. Through the final years of the war, Clarke continued developing specialized equipment for amphibious and airborne missions. He worked on demolition charges for bridge sabotage and experimented with rocket-propelled systems capable of deploying temporary bridges, precursors to combat engineering devices used during the D-Day campaign. Though few of these large-scale prototypes reached combat, they demonstrated the breadth of his imagination. By late war, Clarke's influence within Britain's clandestine weapons programs was undeniable. From small mines to portable launchers, his inventions had shaped how Allied special operations were conducted. Yet official recognition remained minimal. Many of his contributions were hidden under classified project codes, and his role as a civilian limited the honors he could receive. He didn't seem to mind. What drove him was solving problems, the kind others declared impossible. When hostilities finally ended, MD1 was quietly dissolved. Clarke returned to civilian life, leaving behind a legacy scattered across declassified reports and surviving equipment. The secrecy surrounding his work meant that for decades, the public remained unaware of how much Britain's covert success depended on a caravan engineer from Bedford. After the collapse of Germany's war machine, most of Britain's experimental units were disbanded. For many inventors inside MD1, the end of the war meant either recognition or redundancy. For Clarke, it meant uncertainty. The secrecy that had protected his work also erased him from public memory. He had no official title, no clear position, and only fragments of documentation linking him to the devices that had made Britain's covert operations possible. But Clarke didn't stop building. While others returned to peacetime industry, he remained fascinated by the question that had driven him since the beginning: how to make engineering solve problems that seemed unsolvable. With the army now focusing on reconstruction and logistics, his attention shifted toward military engineering rather than demolition. That's when he conceived one of his most ambitious and strange projects: the rocket-powered tank bridge, later known as the Great Eastern. The challenge was clear. During the advance through Europe, Allied forces had struggled with rivers, craters, and destroyed bridges that slowed entire armored divisions. Traditional bridging units required time, cranes, and exposure to enemy fire. Clarke believed there had to be a faster way. His idea was to fit a collapsible metal bridge onto a tank chassis, which could launch the structure using rocket propulsion. In theory, the bridge would unfold in seconds, allowing vehicles to cross obstacles instantly. Clarke sketched the early concepts himself: long, narrow spans built from lightweight alloys, mounted on specialized brackets. He calculated that a series of small, solid-fuel rockets could propel the bridge upward and outward, using momentum and gravity to lock it into position. The design combined the simplicity of his earlier work with a bold mechanical logic. Let the machine do the dangerous part, while soldiers waited behind armor. In late development tests, the Great Eastern proved surprisingly functional. A modified Churchill tank carried the folded bridge, drove to the edge of a gap, and fired the rockets. The bridge shot forward, landed across the obstacle, and anchored itself using retractable claws. Engineers observing the demonstration reportedly laughed at its absurdity, but they couldn't deny the results. The device worked. Clarke envisioned this system being used in the early stages of an invasion, fast, efficient, and largely automated. But by the time his prototype was ready, the war was over. Germany had surrendered, and military priorities shifted from innovation to demobilization. The Great Eastern never saw combat, and Clarke's enthusiasm met official silence. The project was shelved, classified, and eventually forgotten. For Clarke, this was a turning point. The environment that had once rewarded improvisation no longer existed. Peacetime Britain was bound by budgets and bureaucracy. MD1's dissolution meant there was no longer a department willing to take risks on untested concepts. Clarke found himself once again a civilian engineer without official recognition for the ideas he had brought to life. Still, his wartime reputation among insiders earned him small but meaningful acknowledgements. The Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors reviewed post-war claims from designers who had contributed to the Allied victory. In 1953, Clarke received modest payments for several inventions: $400 for the limpet mine, $300 for the altimeter switch, and smaller amounts for demolition devices. It was recognition, but not fame. Most of his colleagues from MD1 received similar symbolic awards, the government preferring discretion over publicity. Returning to Bedford, Clarke reopened his engineering business, adapting wartime methods to civilian products. He continued to design trailers and caravans, applying the same mechanical efficiency that had defined his weapons. Yet the transition wasn't easy. Britain's post-war economy was tight, and competition in light engineering was fierce. Clarke's designs, while functional, were often too advanced or expensive for mass production. He also struggled with the loss of purpose that many wartime innovators experienced. During the conflict, every invention had urgency. Each improvement could save lives or shorten the war. In peace, that urgency vanished. Clarke corresponded with former colleagues, occasionally proposing new ideas for civilian defense systems or portable engineering equipment, but few were accepted. His restless creativity, once an asset, became a frustration. Despite this, he remained active in public life. Clarke joined the Territorial Army, serving in an engineering capacity and maintaining connections with the Intelligence Corps. His technical expertise was occasionally called upon for training and consulting. Later, he entered local politics, becoming a councillor in Bedford and eventually representing the Putney district. His interest in civic issues reflected the same practical mindset that guided his inventions: straightforward, efficient solutions to real problems. Politically, Clarke's views evolved. He had aligned with the Labour Party during the war, but grew disillusioned with its stance on nuclear weapons and disarmament. In 1959, he switched allegiance to the Liberal Party, believing technological progress and defense readiness required balance rather than ideology. Even outside engineering, his thinking remained pragmatic. Privately, Clarke never stopped experimenting. Neighbours recalled the smell of solder and the occasional muffled bang from his workshop. He kept detailed notebooks filled with sketches, improved magnetic clamps, miniature switches, and mechanical timers. Though none reached production, they reveal a mind that never accepted limits. Friends described him as meticulous but approachable, someone who could explain complex mechanisms with clarity and enthusiasm. As the 1950s progressed, the world around him changed. Jet aircraft, nuclear submarines, and electronic warfare defined a new era of technology. Clarke's mechanical ingenuity, the kind that relied on hands-on experimentation, began to feel outdated. Yet his influence persisted quietly in the training manuals of special forces and engineering corps that still used variants of his wartime designs. The principles he established, simplicity, portability, reliability, remained foundational to modern sabotage and special operations equipment. Recognition came slowly. Military historians began revisiting the story of Britain's covert weapons programs, uncovering names buried in classified archives. Clarke's appeared repeatedly, attached to reports on the limpet mine, the spigot gun, and early demolition systems. Former colleagues credited him as one of the most inventive members of MD1, a man whose mechanical intuition often achieved what larger teams failed to produce. But Clarke himself rarely spoke publicly about his role. He preferred to let the results speak for themselves. By the end of the decade, his health began to decline. Years of exposure to chemicals, explosives, and stress had taken their toll. Yet even then, he continued corresponding with younger engineers and local enthusiasts, encouraging innovation and experimentation. He believed that wartime inventiveness shouldn't be lost to peace, that the willingness to question and test was as vital in industry as it had been in battle. Cecil Vandepeer Clarke died in 1961, largely unknown outside specialist circles. Newspapers mentioned his passing briefly, noting his military service and civic work, but saying little about his inventions. The devices he created, however, continued to influence design philosophy within military engineering for decades. The limpet mine remained in service long after his death, refined but fundamentally unchanged, a testament to its enduring simplicity. For almost 20 years after his death, Cecil Vandepeer Clarke's name barely appeared in the historical record. His inventions existed, his patents were archived, and his devices continued to influence military engineering. But the man behind them had effectively vanished. This was the unintended consequence of secrecy. The Special Operations Executive and MD1 had been dissolved under confidentiality laws, and for decades the files that described their work remained classified. The public knew of the missions, but not the makers of the weapons that made them possible. By the late 1970s, interest in Britain's wartime research units began to grow. Historians tracing the origins of unconventional warfare uncovered a pattern of references to civilian contractors who developed devices for sabotage. Among these anonymous engineers, one name kept surfacing in the background of the reports: C.V. Clarke. The discovery led researchers to Bedford, where fragments of his business records and private notebooks still survived. They revealed the scope of his contribution, far broader than the few weapons publicly known. Clarke's designs had quietly influenced the evolution of modern special operations equipment. The limpet mine, for example, became a foundational concept for underwater demolition charges used through the Cold War. The core principles, magnetic adhesion, time delay detonation, and waterproof simplicity, were copied and refined by multiple nations. Naval frogmen in the 1950s and 60s used updated versions that looked almost identical to Clarke's original prototype. Even decades later, the same mechanics were found in sabotage devices recovered from covert operations in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. His approach had outlasted the war that inspired it. Military engineers studying the evolution of portable explosives began referencing Clarke's work as the bridge between pre-war mechanical engineering and modern combat innovation. Before Clarke, sabotage technology had been an afterthought, improvised tools assembled in the field. After Clarke, it became a discipline of its own. His insistence on reliability and portability established design standards that influenced generations of weapons engineers. The principle of field service simplicity, the idea that a device should be operable with minimal tools or training, became central to Special Forces doctrine worldwide. As government archives gradually opened, the public began learning more about Churchill's Toyshop, the nickname for MD1. What emerged was a picture of a small, highly efficient organization where independent thinkers like Clarke had been allowed to experiment freely. Reporters and historians were surprised by the informality of it. Ordinary workshops, simple materials, and handwritten sketches leading to weapons that shaped entire campaigns. Clarke's contributions were finally given context. He had not merely built gadgets, he had embodied the wartime philosophy of necessity-driven invention. Several of his surviving prototypes were rediscovered in military museums and private collections. The Imperial War Museum catalogued examples of his magnetic limpet mine and early spigot launchers, noting their simplicity and enduring mechanical soundness. A few remained fully functional after decades in storage, a testament to the precision of their construction. The reappearance of these artifacts reignited interest in the anonymous engineers who had powered Britain's secret war. Clarke's work also drew attention from scholars studying innovation under pressure. They highlighted how his transition from civilian to weapons designer mirrored a broader wartime trend. Ordinary engineers, mechanics, and craftsmen being recruited into classified programs. Clarke became a case study in adaptability, proof that the skills of peacetime industry could transform warfare when redirected towards survival. His caravans and trailers had taught him to balance weight, durability, and efficiency. Those same calculations became the backbone of sabotage engineering. The rediscovery of Clarke's files revealed several experimental ideas that had never reached production. Among them were prototypes for timed magnetic mines shaped to mimic sea debris, mechanical anti-tamper fuses that disabled themselves if disturbed, and early concepts for remote triggering through mechanical vibration rather than electronics. Each demonstrated his belief that complexity was the enemy of reliability. Even as technology advanced towards circuits and radio triggers, Clarke's purely mechanical solutions remained admired for their dependability. In the broader timeline of warfare, Clarke's philosophy became increasingly relevant. During the Cold War, both Western and Eastern Bloc militaries revived interest in low-cost, easily concealable demolition tools. Many of these designs resembled Clarke's devices more than the sophisticated electronic models of the time. His legacy lived on not through recognition, but through imitation. By the 1990s, declassification of MD1's records allowed a clearer picture to form. Historians confirmed that Clarke had contributed not only to the limpet mine and spigot gun, but also to a range of auxiliary tools, from portable charges for bridge demolition to compact fuses used by Allied saboteurs in France and Norway. His methods for training operatives were also preserved in manuals recovered from SOE archives. They describe procedures for setting underwater charges, constructing makeshift magnets, and calculating detonation timing, all derived from Clarke's original instructions. The narrative of Britain's wartime innovation was rewritten accordingly. Figures like Barnes Wallis, who built the bouncing bomb, and Geoffrey Pike, who conceived Project Habakkuk, were already celebrated. Clarke, though less publicized, began appearing beside them in research papers and documentaries as the practical counterpart, the man who made small-scale sabotage achievable. His story resonated precisely because it lacked grandeur. He represented the quiet, methodical engineer whose impact was measured not in fame but in function. Clarke's influence even extended into non-military engineering. Several of his trailer suspension systems, originally designed before the war, inspired later generations of low-loading transport vehicles. His approach to stress distribution and modular assembly prefigured methods used in heavy-duty logistics and automotive design. The same engineer who had built covert weapons had also helped define how Britain moved goods and machinery in the post-war economy. As more details emerged, public fascination grew. Authors writing about Churchill's Toyshop and the SOE began including Clarke's name in their narratives. Television documentaries and history programs depicted him as one of the archetypal backroom inventors of World War II, civilians whose creativity, substituted for industrial resources, Britain lacked. Viewers were intrigued by the idea that devices conceived in small workshops had influenced global events. Yet the recognition remained mostly academic. There were no monuments, no national honors. Clarke's descendants, where traced, received occasional correspondence from historians, but no official commemoration. His legacy existed in the pages of technical journals, not in marble or bronze. And perhaps that was fitting. His life's work had been about invisibility. Weapons that left no signature, missions that left no trace. By the 21st century, the technology of warfare had changed beyond anything Cecil Vandepeer Clarke could have imagined. Computers guided missiles, drones replaced reconnaissance pilots, and electronic fuses handled what once required gears and springs. Yet behind the digital sophistication, the principles that governed Clarke's inventions still guided design. Make it portable, make it reliable, make it simple enough to survive the field. Modern special operations engineers studying historical innovation often begin their analysis with the SOE and MD1 archives. Within those pages, Clarke's name reappears repeatedly beside sketches of limpet mines, launchers, and timers annotated in his own hand. His notes, plain handwriting, exact measurements, and minimal jargon illustrate a design philosophy that anticipated modern modular engineering. Instead of focusing on complex systems, he broke problems down into small, self-contained parts. That approach still defines how special operations devices are built today. The influence of Clarke's methods extends far beyond explosives. The concept of the operator-proof device, equipment so intuitive that even under stress it cannot be misused, originated in MD1's design doctrine, shaped largely by Clarke's training experience. Whether it is a modern breaching charge, a GPS detonator, or a drone-deployed sensor, the user interface still follows the same logic. One function, one purpose, minimal failure points. In that sense, Clarke's mechanical simplicity became a psychological design standard. Naval historians also recognize his role in establishing the foundation for underwater sabotage tactics. Before Clarke, underwater demolition relied on cumbersome contact mines or diver-carried charges that required manual ignition. His magnetic limpet mine replaced both. The design combined hydrodynamics, magnetism, and human ergonomics in one unit, a rare feat at the time. Decades later, the same core concept influenced magnetic hull inspection tools and remotely operated demolition systems used by navies worldwide. A weapon intended for covert destruction became the blueprint for maintenance and rescue technology as well. In British engineering circles, Clarke's story has become a quiet case study in creativity under constraint. Wartime Britain lacked resources, manpower, and time. Clarke demonstrated that innovation could thrive precisely because of those limits. His success with inexpensive materials, bowls, magnets, and rubber seals proved that functionality depended on insight, not funding. That philosophy now underpins countless research programs focused on low-cost, high-impact engineering for developing regions and disaster relief. Few of those modern engineers realize they are following the same logic that once guided a saboteur's toolkit. As more of MD1's documentation reached the public domain, Clarke's legacy gained renewed scholarly attention. Authors and filmmakers revisited his contributions, contrasting his anonymity with the fame of wartime scientists who had worked under full military authority. Clarke represented the civilian engineer as national asset, an individual who brought private sector efficiency into military problem-solving. In post-war Britain, this model became institutionalized through defense partnerships with industry, a structure that remains standard today. The idea that civilian innovators could outperform traditional military bureaucracy began with men like him. One of the most striking reassessments came from historians of ethics and technology. Clarke's inventions were designed for sabotage and destruction, yet they embodied a peculiar restraint. His limpet mines targeted ships, not civilians. His timing mechanisms allowed withdrawal before detonation. His training emphasized precision and avoidance of unnecessary loss. In an era defined by total war, he built tools meant for limited, focused action. Analysts now view this as an early form of ethical engineering in combat, a recognition that precision reduces suffering. In that sense, his mechanical discipline carried moral weight. Modern explosive ordnance technicians who handle vintage equipment still encounter Clarke's fingerprints. When deactivating old magnetic charges recovered from harbors or wrecks, they find standardized screw patterns, waterproof seals, and fuse mounts consistent with his workshop's production notes. Even the numbering system stamped on prototypes matches those used by MD1. Each recovered device is both artifact and evidence, a glimpse into the logic of an inventor who valued mechanical perfection above recognition. Educational institutions have also begun to use Clarke's story as a teaching tool. Engineering programs at several British universities include case studies on MD1 to illustrate rapid prototyping and iterative testing. Clarke's insistence on practical demonstration rather than theoretical approval now aligns closely with modern design thinking methodology. His workshop culture, build, test, modify, repeat, prefigured what modern engineers call agile development. The parallel is unintentional but unmistakable. As awareness of his role grew, so did the question of remembrance. Should a man who designed weapons for sabotage be celebrated? Historians tend to answer by emphasizing impact rather than ideology. Clarke did not design for destruction as an end in itself. He designed for effectiveness under necessity. His work shortened missions, reduced risk, and helped bring a brutal conflict closer to its end. Recognition in this context becomes less about glorification and more about understanding the mechanics of survival. In 2010, several exhibitions on Britain's secret wartime laboratories included Clarke's designs alongside those of his contemporaries. The displays focused on the inventors' diversity, academics, mechanics, hobbyists, united by urgency rather than background. Clarke's section stood out for its practicality, sketches of the limpet mine, photographs of divers training in pools, and fragments of the spigot gun assembly. Visitors were struck by how ordinary the materials looked. There were no advanced alloys, no electronics, just craftsmanship and logic. It was a reminder that ingenuity often hides behind simplicity. Today, researchers exploring the lineage of special operations technology trace a direct line from Clarke's work to current systems used by elite units. The idea of modular sabotage kits, magnetic hull attachments, and self-arming timers owes its foundation to his wartime experiments. Even drone warfare, in its mechanical precision and operator-simplified control, echoes his principle of complex results from simple actions. His name might not appear in modern manuals, but his influence lives within their design philosophy. Clarke's legacy also challenges a deeper assumption about innovation, that progress depends on scale. His career proved the opposite. Working in small teams, often with improvised equipment, he achieved more functional breakthroughs than larger institutions burdened by oversight. The pattern repeats in modern technology, startups and military innovation hubs, small, independent groups producing rapid, disruptive solutions. The structure that once defined MD1 has quietly re-emerged in 21st century engineering culture. As historians continue to uncover forgotten contributors to the Allied victory, Clarke's name finally holds its place among them. He may never achieve the recognition of public figures like Turing or Wallace, but within the realm of applied engineering, he occupies a unique position, an innovator whose creations bridged craftsmanship and strategy. Every generation that re-examines the mechanics of his devices finds the same lesson. Brilliance often hides behind practicality.